Hi everybody, it's Janet with Fruit of the Vine Art Studio here, and it's 8 p.m. and it's Wednesday, and it's the last Wednesday in July. Well, you know, the whole month of July is come and is just about gone, and we've been meeting here for over a month and telling wondrous stories that have been told since the beginning of time from the greatest book ever written, and hearing a simple reminder of God's love for us. There's been an underlying theme in every story that we've told, and the theme is love and faith. Let's look back at the stories we've heard and remember the lessons that were taught in each one. Now, if you remember in our first episode, there was Noah and the Amazing Ark. That story started with Noah and his family. Now, Noah was an older fella, and he was the father of 3 sons. And Noah was a good man, and God blessed him with a very long life. So long that he was actually 500 years old when his life began to dramatically change. Because Noah was a man who worshiped God, and it was during a time in history where not many people were behaving very good, and that made God very sad and hurt. And I know you remember that God may get very angry at our sins and the bad things that we might do, but he still loves us. God is love. So even when he's very disappointed in us, he still loves us dearly, and he wants the best for each of us. And even though God was so angry that he destroyed everything on the planet except for Noah and his family and the animals in the ark, God gave a great reminder of his promise, his covenant to Noah. He put a rainbow in the sky. So, whenever you see a beautiful rainbow, stop and say a little prayer to thank the Lord that he loves us so much and that he is so faithful to his promises. Now, our next story was about Daniel and the lion's den. This story we learned about faith and friendship, and how our character influences others around us. We saw a positive influence in Daniel because of his good reputation and his faithfulness, and that helped him gain influence with King Darius, who later turned to God because of Daniel. And we also saw how a negative influence by the 2 evil administrators convinced others to do evil and sin. That same negative influence even convinced King Darius to enact the unjust law. Now, we discussed how a negative influence affects those around us, how gossips and lies can harm others, and they can cause us to sin. And when we sin, there are negative results. And we need to remember that if we're trying to be a good influence, it's important that you ask God to help you change any bad habits or any bad attitude that you might have, so that you could be a positive influence to others who are watching you as their example. In our third story, the episode was about Jonah and the big fish. In that story, we learned how you can't hide from God. Jonah tried to run and hide from God. This story reminds us that God is always there. He knows all. He sees all. You can't hide from God in the belly of a boat. He'll never leave you, even in the belly of a big fish. And God will provide for you, even if it's just shade from the sun to keep you cool. He knows your every need. God knows exactly what each of us needs to hear, and God has something special that he wants each of us to know about his message to us. There are consequences for our sins, and God is holy and he must correct our sins. And although God must correct us, he is also a merciful and loving God. He is kind and compassionate, and he truly wants all of us to turn from sin and live a life that's pleasing to him. Now, that story was followed by David and Goliath. And that story reminded us that no matter how old you are, how big or how small you are, God can use us to do important things. He thinks that every single one of us is important and that we have a purpose for being here. With God's help, you can do lots of amazing things. You can pray for people. You can help others. You can overcome all kinds of obstacles with His help. And not everybody is afraid of the exact same things. But everyone, no matter how big or how small, faces problems. And remember that God is your helper. We may never have to face a giant, but we may have to face a gigantic problem. You don't need to be scared. You can trust in God because He knows who you are on the inside. He knows your dreams and your hopes and what your attitude's really like, if you're being helpful or not, and if you're being selfish or not. He knows if you're trying to do the right thing. God knows and He sees all. And God looks at your heart. And you can turn to God in prayer about things that bother you, or your problems that you're having, or any kind of a scary situation that you could be in. He knows you and He loves you and He will help. God is with you during all of these times. And in that story we saw how David trusted God to help him. He had a strong faith in God. I encourage you to seek God in prayer when you feel overwhelmed. He can help us do anything. It's important to remember that God only sees what's on the inside. And no matter what age we are, God can use us. You can trust God. David trusted God, and God used David to help save the Israelites from the enemy. In that story, the next story we learned about families. And that story was the story of Joseph and the multicolored coat. That story taught us that we all have special talents, and that it's important not to want what others have, but to be happy with what God has given us. We also learned that we are our brother's keeper, and that includes more than just your siblings or even your family. That we are here to look out for one another and to love one another. Joseph was his brother's keepers even when his brothers hadn't shown him love. He was not just his brother's keepers in the sense of the word brother either. He saved an entire generation of people who would have otherwise starved. He never forgot his family, and he was there for them in their times of trouble. Now, in that story, we also learned about how God made families and the different relationships that we have within our families, how God gave each of us special talents that He wants us to use to bring Him glory. Everyone is important to God, and God made all of us just a little bit different. We need to realize that everyone has different abilities, and that we need to be happy for the special abilities that God has given us and not wish that we had someone else's special talent. God also made families so that we could help each other find our special talents. And when I say family, I don't just mean mom or dad or your brothers or your sisters. I mean your whole family. He gave you grandmas and aunts and uncles and cousins and more. God loves everyone in our family. He gave us all these people to help support us and guide us in our choices and to help us in our times of trouble. Each person in our family has a special talent that was given to them by God. And we don't need to compare ourselves to others. When we compare ourselves with others, we become confused. We begin to want what they have when we should be using what God's equipped us with for our own special missions. And to remember that we don't always need to be thanked. We can do it anonymously. You don't always have to tell everyone when you do something good, because God already knows. He sees what we do, and He will reward us someday. Now, today is going to be the final episode. And in the final episode, we're going to learn about a man named Gideon. And in this story, we'll learn that even if we don't believe in ourselves, that God believes in you, and He wouldn't ask you to do something that He knows would not be to your benefit. Even if you have questions about your faith, trust in God and He will show you His awesome power. He can take you from a nobody and make you into a leader, an influencer. That the things that you do and the things that you say are important, and how you treat others will make a difference in the end. Gideon inspired others to follow him even when it seemed like a losing battle. And those followers, they found their way to God through Gideon. I think it's about time to start that story, don't you? This is the story of Gideon's trumpet. The story of Gideon starts out in a time when the Midianites had taken control of Israel. The Midianites weren't friendly, to say the least. They took or they ruined all of the crops and the animals that belonged to the Israelites. And things had gotten so bad that the Israelites had to flee from their homes, and they were hiding in caves. The Israelites had nothing left, and they finally cried out to God for help. And God heard their cries. Just like always, he sees and he hears all. And God had a plan. The awesome thing about this story is even if God wasn't happy with the Israelites at that time, he still listened to them and he answered their prayers. Now this is where our story begins. Gideon and his family were living in a cave, and Gideon had gone to a field in a hidden place so that the Midianites wouldn't see him and steal the wheat from him. And he was beating the wheat grains from the stalks when an angel of the Lord appeared to him. And the angel said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And Gideon said to the angel, "Oh, sir, if the Lord is really with us, why is all this bad stuff happening? Where are all the miracles that our fathers told us about? Why has the Lord forsaken us and put us under the rule of the Midianites?" Now this was long after the people had been led across the Red Sea on the dry ground, and God had performed many miracles in the past. But Gideon, he felt hopeless, and he felt hopeless for his people. The Lord replied to Gideon, "Go with your strength and your might and save Israel from the Midianites. I'm sending you." Suddenly, Gideon got nervous and he started making excuses as to why he couldn't go. "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? I am the smallest and the youngest in my family, and my people are weak." And the Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall defeat all of the Midianites." But this still didn't convince Gideon. He still wasn't sure that was God really telling him this. You know, back then they didn't have a Bible. And Gideon just wanted to be sure. And Gideon said to the Lord, "If you are with me, then show me a sign that it is you asking me. Please wait here and I will bring you a present." And the Lord waited. Gideon prepared an altar to place an offering to God. Now, that was how they used to give gifts, and they would ask for forgiveness to God. Now, that was before Jesus died on the cross. The offering was some meat and unleavened bread. And the angel told Gideon to place the offering on the rock. And then, with the tip of the staff that was in the angel's hand, the angel touched the rock and a fire shot out of it, and it consumed the meat and the bread. And then the angel disappeared. Ooh, this scared Gideon even more. Now, he was terrified. Oh, don't go anywhere, Gideon, he's so terrified. He realized it was really the Lord that had been with him. And he cried out, "Oh, alas, oh God! Now I've seen the Lord's angel face to face. What will become of me?" But the Lord said to him, "Peace be with you. Don't be afraid. You shall not die." Now later that night, while Gideon was resting, the Lord said to him, "Take your father's bull and another bull that he has at 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father had made, and then cut down the Asherah pole." Both of those were made for another god that people wanted to worship back then. "And when you're done, build an altar to the Lord your God on top of there. Now, the Israelites had started believing in these pretend gods again, and that was why God had been angry with them in the first place. Our God is the only real and true God, and these people had been praying and giving offerings to statues and pieces of wood that couldn't do anything. Gideon gathered up 10 servants that night to help him because he was afraid of what his father would think, and he didn't want to upset the people of the town if he did this during the day. So he worked by night. He knew the people would be mad if he tore up their false idols and their altars. And he was right. The very next day, when the men of the town woke up in the morning and they saw what had happened during the night, they were more upset. They wanted justice. They said to one another, "Who has done this thing?" They heard a rumor that Gideon had done this. So they went to his father, Joash, and they said to him, "Bring out your son Gideon. He has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah pole, and he must die." They demanded justice. But Gideon's father, Joash, he knew that his son was a good and a just man. There had to be some kind of a mistake here. He'd been the one that had built the altar to Baal, and now his son was going to have to die. So he stood up for Gideon, and he said to the men of the town, "If this god Baal is really a god, then he will punish Gideon. He'll fight for himself if he is real. He'll be mad about his altar being destroyed." Now, because Gideon's father felt so strongly about the matter, and he had been the one who had built that altar in the first place, the people of the town decided to let the god Baal fend for himself and punish Gideon if he needed punishment. And of course, nothing ever happened, because Baal wasn't a real god. He's just a false idol. Now, all of the Midianites and all of the Amalekites and the people of the east had crossed the river Jordan, and they had set up camp in the valley of Jezreel, preparing for the battle and hoping to gain more territory. But the Spirit of the Lord was with Gideon, and Gideon called out upon the Abiezrites to fight with him. And Gideon also sent messengers throughout the land to gather an army to fight against those Midianites and return the homeland to them. People came from all around to join Gideon's army. But still, Gideon wondered why the Lord would send someone like him. He didn't feel as strong and courageous as he thought that someone should. And he began doubting whether or not God would save the Israelites. So he asked God for a sign. He placed a piece of wool from a sheep on the ground, and he said, "If you will save Israel by my hand, then in the morning there should be dew only on the fleece, but the ground all around the dew should be dry." And the next morning, it was so. In fact, the fleece was so wet that when Gideon wrung it, there was enough water in it to fill a bowl. But that still wasn't enough to convince Gideon. The ground had been dry, but maybe the fleece had pulled the water up from the nearby ground. So Gideon asked God for another sign. "Please do not be mad at me. Let me make one more request. Please let me test the fleece once more. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on the ground let there be dew in the morning." And the next morning, when Gideon arose, the fleece was dry, but the ground around it was sopping wet. Gideon took the fleece and he tried to wring some water out of it, but it was totally dry. Now this did make Gideon feel more confident the Lord was with him. So Gideon gathered up the army, and he set off for the midnight camp. And he was feeling pretty good that morning. And he had lots and lots of men to fight with him. But better than that, he had God. And God had promised to help them win. Now, Gideon and his men, they set up their camp north of where the Midian camp was. They camped on a hill near the valley. But God had something else in mind. He said to Gideon, "Your army is too large. If you were to win today, no one would even give me a second thought. They'll think that they won on their own with no help from me. Go to your men and say to them, 'Whoever is afraid may go home.'" And believe it or not, when Gideon did that, 22,000 men went home. That is a lot of people. That was more than half of the whole army with Gideon. Now there was only 10,000 men left. Gideon still felt good about the situation, though. He knew God was with him. And there was still 10,000 men. That's a lot of men, right? But that didn't last long either. Next, God said to Gideon, "There are still too many people. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Separate the men when they drink. Each one who laps the water like a dog with their tongue, set to one side. And those who cup the water with their hands, separate them into another group." So Gideon took the army down to drink some of the water. Now this probably took some time. Think about it. He had to watch 10,000 men get to the water, and then he had to watch how they were drinking, and then he had to separate them into two groups. But eventually, all 10,000 men had gotten a drink, and they had been separated into those who used their hands and those who used their tongues. It's surprising, but 300 of the men got down and drank from the water like a dog. So Gideon figured those would be the ones that would be sent home. But once again, God had something else in mind. He told Gideon to send the men who cupped the water home, and the remaining 300 would be his army. 300. Now that way, when they won, the Israelites would know that God was in control with only 300 men in that army. Gideon wondered how God was going to help them win. There were so many Midianites and just 300 of them. He was so worried he couldn't even sleep that night. During the night, the Lord spoke to Gideon again, and he said, "If you're still scared and you need proof that I will help you win, go down in the valley where the Midianites are staying and listen to what they're saying. And afterwards, you will feel confident, and I will be at your side." So guess what Gideon did? Gideon took his servant Purah with him, and he went to the outpost of the armed men where there was the Midianite camp. Now there was so many Midianites and Amalekites and all of the people of the east, so many enemies down in that valley. There was so many down there. It was like a plague of locusts swarming around. So many camels and tents and people. And it says in the Bible that there was as many as the sand that is on the seashore. That is an awful lot of people and tents and camels. It was like a madhouse down there. But Gideon and Purah snuck up next to the tent, and they listened to what they were saying inside. And they could hear one man telling his dream to another man. And he said, "I dreamt that a round loaf of bread come rolling down the hill into our camp, and it came so fast that when it struck the tent fell and turned upside down." Now the other man, who had been listening to the dream, said, "Well, this must mean that the sword of Gideon and his God will help him. They're going to win against us." And as soon as Gideon heard that, he worshipped God, and then he ran back to the camp with Purah, and he was yelling, "Arise! Arise! The Lord has given us the midnight camp. Get up and fight!" Gideon divided the 300 men into 3 groups, and he put trumpets in their hands, and he gave them jars with torches inside of the jar, and he told them to watch him and to do what he did. "When I blow my trumpet, all of you with me are to blow your trumpets and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon!'" Gideon and his men surrounded the camp in 3 groups. Now remember, they were high up on the hill looking down into the valley. And when Gideon started to blow his trumpet, the others followed by blowing theirs. And while they blew their trumpets, and they yelled, "For the Lord and for Gideon!" And then they smashed their jars and they lit their torches. Holding their torches in one hand and their trumpets in the other, they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" All of Gideon's men held their place on the hillside while blowing their trumpets and yelling. But down in the valley, the Midianites and the Amalekites and all of the people of the east, all of those enemies down there started freaking out. They were running around and they were yelling and they were screaming in their own camp, and the Lord made the blaring of the 300 trumpets going off at the same time to cause such a great confusion in the enemy's camp that they began to fight with each other and kill each other. Think about that for a moment. I bet that was really confusing for all of them down there. Here it was, the middle of the night, and they had been sleeping, and suddenly these trumpets were blaring, and the sound of things being broken and smashed, and people yelling and surrounding them. It must have just been terrifying when they woke up. And then to have the Lord cause even major confusion upon them, that they began to attack one another. But there were some who managed to live through this confusion, and they fled the town. Those that got away were headed to the town of Ephraim by the river Jordan. Now, because Gideon had sent his messengers ahead, the people of Ephraim knew that Gideon and his army were in pursuit of the Midianites. And when they got there, all the men of Ephraim came out to fight, and they captured the 2 princes of Midian. But the kings of Midian had escaped. And the men of Ephraim were upset with Gideon for not coming for them sooner, and they said to him, "Why didn't you call us when you went to fight? We would have helped." And the more they talked, the madder they got. And finally Gideon said to him, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Didn't God deliver into your hands the 2 princes of the Midian? What have I done in comparison with you? I've captured no one." Then their anger against Gideon went away, and they felt better about what they had accomplished. Gideon and his army then pursued the Midianites across the river Jordan to the town of Succoth. And when they arrived in Succoth, Gideon's army was hungry, and they were weak, and they were exhausted. And Gideon asked the men of Succoth, Please give loaves of bread to the army with me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after the 2 kings of Midian." But the officials in Succoth said to Gideon, "Have you yet caught the kings of Midian? Why should we give bread to your army?" So Gideon said, "Well then, when I do capture them, and I will whip your flesh with the briars and the thorns from the wilderness." Next, Gideon and his men came to Penuel, and he asked them in the same way for the help and food. And the men there answered Gideon in the same way that the men of Succoth had. They refused to help. And Gideon told them that when he returned in peace, that he would break down their tower. Now the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, were now in the town of Karkor with their army. Now their army had once been nearly 140,000 men, but it had dwindled down now to just the remaining 15,000. And although Gideon had only 300 men with him, they went up and they attacked that army. They were still confident that they were going to win back all of their territory. Now the two kings fled, but Gideon caught up with them and he captured them. This threw the whole army into a panic and they fled. Now on his way back, when Gideon's army came to Penuel, he did break down that tower just as he said he would. And when he got to Succoth, Gideon captured a young man there and he questioned him. And the young man gave Gideon a list of 77 men who were the officials and the elders of Succoth. And now, when Gideon came to those men, he said, "Behold, I have captured the two kings of Midian, as I said I would. They have been delivered into my hands. Did you not mock and taunt me when I asked for your help? I asked for bread for my army, who was exhausted from the battle, and you refused?" And Gideon whipped them with the thorns and the briars from the wilderness, and he taught them a lesson. And when Gideon and his men returned to Israel, the people said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." And Gideon's reply was, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you, but the Lord will rule over you." And the land had 40 years of rest in the days of Gideon. Now, that is how God saved Gideon and defeated the Midianites. And without God, none of this was possible. I hope that after this, Gideon learned his lesson and he stopped being such a worrywart, because with God, nothing is impossible. Next time you're in a tough situation, know that God will help you. Just ask. He is just waiting for you to ask. Think about Gideon. He was a person who went from scared and full of doubt to full of faith and courageous. He doubted himself, and he even doubted that God was going to help his people. The Lord tells Gideon that he would use him to free Israel from the Midianites, and Gideon still expressed his doubt that God would use someone like him to deliver Israel. He wanted reassurance. He questioned God and he tested God, and God turned that scared man into a leader. Who would have picked Gideon to be a leader? Certainly not Gideon. He didn't see himself as a leader, and despite his doubts, God used him. People rallied around him, and he led Israel to the most lopsided victory in the nation's history. He progressed from a nobody to a ruler, a leader of his people. What caused people to get behind Gideon? Sometimes a good cause isn't always enough for others to join in. People follow leaders who demonstrate that they are worthy and that they are promoting a worthy cause. You cannot separate the leader from the cause. Once the followers gain confidence in the leader, then they'll feel confident about the cause. Leaders all have very common characteristics. They have a calling. Gideon doubted himself, and he lived in fear, and he asked for multiple signs from God. And once Gideon accepted and embraced his calling, passion and boldness filled his heart. He had insight. God gave Gideon insight into the weaknesses of the Midianites. Gideon understood, and he had insight that God was going to help him win. He had charisma. When the people of Ephraim were asked to join in the chase, they got angry. And Gideon helped them realize the very importance of the part that they had played by capturing the two princes. He had a talent. The angel called Gideon a mighty warrior. Gideon had hidden talents that he had yet to discover. He had ability. Gideon could get things done, and people are attracted to leaders who have proven their abilities. And he had communication skills. Gideon was able to communicate his calling and his vision so well, he had over 30,000 people willing to go to war with him. And he had character. It takes character to win and keep people's trust. Gideon stood up when others wouldn't. He displayed courage and he led his people to victory. He had character. He started at home with just 10 servants and he destroyed the Baal temple. He had charisma. He won over his father's influence and the people of his town. He had credibility. He won over the whole city. He broadened his circle. He culminated his timing and he moved at the right time. So many people had joined his army that God had to send some of them home. God created all of us to be leaders and influencers at some level. The characteristics I described can be applied to everyone's life and to every type of a relationship. You can become a leader and an influencer in God's kingdom. I can't imagine having a better boss to work for. Can you? The main thing to remember from all of the stories is that our God created us and he loves every one of us. You, me, my family, your family, my friends, your neighbors, my neighbors, even those people we've never met. Everybody around the whole world. He doesn't care how old you are, or how young you are, or how big or how small you are, how scared or how bold you are. He doesn't look at your hair color. He doesn't look at your skin color. He doesn't care where you live or what language you speak. He loves you. He forgives you. And he will provide for you. All you have to do is accept his love. And I just want you guys to know how much fun I have had doing this. It has really brought me lots of joy to be here with you each week. And I do hope that you've enjoyed this time too. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to be doing next Wednesday, but I'll be here at 8. If you want to join me, maybe I'll do a craft. Maybe I'll tell another story. Who knows? Now, this story, the story of Gideon and his trumpet, comes from the greatest book ever written, the Bible. And it can be found in the book of Judges, chapters 6 through 8. Thanks again, and before closing, I'd like to share a Bible verse with you. And this is from Proverbs, chapter 8, verse 17. I love them that love me, and those that seek me early shall find me. And as the old Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song goes, teach your children well. I really had fun doing this, guys. I can see you all joining me tonight, and I really appreciate you being here. Thanks so much. Bye now.